Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma daf Zayin. Shavua Tov to everyone. We ended yesterday's daf with we all of a sudden connected with this idea that the Kohen Gadol separates for 7 days before he starts doing the Avodat Yom Kippurim. To which we then said, why are we worried about separating him from his wife? By the way, the whole issue of a Bo'el Nida becoming impure, like the Nida, came up in the Parsha yesterday. I hope you noticed. And we said, why are we so worried about that? And we're not worried about Tumat Meit, which is also a 7-day impurity. To which the Gemara gave 2 answers. One was to say, from here we can infer the Tumah is Hutra b'tzibur. Tumah is totally permitted and overridden when it comes to tzibur, and this is a communal offering. So therefore, it doesn't matter if he's impure. He's allowed to do it in a state of impurity, which is a topic we're going to discuss a lot today. Or Ravina, who said, well, you could still say Tumah is dechuya, and we're going to mention later that the reason maybe why Ravina wanted to say this is because we actually hold in the end that Tumah is dechuya b'tzibur. It's only pushed aside. Okay, which means it's still there. And therefore, we try to avoid it as best as possible. And yet, why are we not worried about it when it comes to the Kohen Gadol? So we say that's because Tumat Meit lo shchicha and Tumat Beit lo shchicha. It's much more likely that he'll become impure from his wife rather than becoming impure from a dead person. So therefore, again, it would only be impure to his wife if she happens to be a nida and if they happen to have relations, which is also not the most common, but they say that's more common than him becoming impure to a dead body. To which we brought up that this idea of Tumah Hutra and Tumah Dechuya is a machloka between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet. Today, later in today's daf, we're going to actually see that some people say that, or the Gemara is going to say, in order to answer a question, they're going to prove that it's actually a Tanaitic debate, also not just between these 2 Amoraim, but also is a debate between Tanaim. But first, we're going to start with Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet, and now we're going to say, and then we saw that it's a debate about whether it's about exactly what case they have a machloket, but we're going to move on past that. And now we're going to start with the beginning of our daf, Amar Rav Sheshet. Mina amin Allah. Where's my proof text? Today is a very simple structure. We're going to start off, I'll tell you the structure already. We're going to start off with Rav Sheshet's proof text, where he's going to prove it from a Tanaitic source, from the Tosefta. Then we're going to bring 3 sources, one also from the Tosefta, and 2 other Tanaitic sources against Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman's going to answer each of them, how they fit in with his approach. Remember, Rav Nachman says, Tumah Hutra, it's as if it's entirely gone. Then we're going to bring a question on Rav Sheshet, although some people actually have a different version and say it's actually a 4th question on Rav Nachman, but we're going to read it the way it appears in our text as a question on Rav Sheshet. So then we're going to have a question on him and answer it, as I already told you, by saying there's a Tanaitic debate about this. When you have an Amora, and you bring a source, a Tanaitic source, to disagree with that Amora, either you have to go with the approach of the Rav Nachman ones, which is we come up with some way to read that source that doesn't contradict. We can come up with multiple readings of sources, as you know. Or when you can't do that, one of the other options is to say, well, it's a source of a Tanaitic debate. Now, you can't just say this without proving it, but they're going to prove it. They're going to bring a different Tanaitic source, which shows a debate between 2 Tanaim, and they're going to show that somehow that debate seems to be having to do with whether we say Tumah is Hutra or Dechuya. And that's basically our structure for today. So it's actually a pretty short daf. Mina amin Allah. Ditanya, as it says in the following Braita, which, as I said, is a Tosefta. And there's no word when they introduce a Tosefta that specifically tells you it's a Tosefta. The reason you would know this is by looking in the Masoret Hashas on the side, which tells you where the sources are. Okay, so it tells you it's a Tosefta in Menachot. Haya omeru makriv. Actually, this one doesn't say for some reason. It says it's a Menachot, but it also is a Menachot in the Gemara there, but it also comes from the Tosefta. Haya omeru makriv minchat haomer. You're standing there doing the sacrifice of the Omer, which is what we're talking about now. We're in Sfirat HaOmer, which started with this Korban HaOmer they did on the 16th of Nisan, the day after the first day of Yantif, and of Pesach. You're about to sacrifice the Minchat HaOmer, the meal offering, which you do with the new barley crop. V'nitmet biyado, and all of a sudden, it became impure in his hands. What does he do? Now, if you say Tumah Hutra b'tzibur, it's entirely permitted, then what would you say? He just continues and goes on with whatever he's doing because it's a communal offering and no problem. But what does the Gemara say? Omer u'mevi'in acheret tachteh. he tells the people nearby, and they bring a different barley crop, right? They bring one that wasn't impure. Vim ein sham elahi, but if all they have is that one, omrim lo, here's a great line, heve pikach ushtok, be smart and be quiet about it. Don't make a big scene. Don't tell everybody, oh, there's tumah here, but we're going to do it anyway. Because what will happen, right, this is classic. Let's say he gets up and he announces, listen, everybody, it just became tameh, impure, but we're going to do it anyway because there's this concept of tumah hutra b'tzibur, okay, or dechuyahi b'tzibur. Now, what will happen? Well, people often hear half of what you say. So they'll say, oh, look, you can bring something even though it's impure in the temple. And they'll think that you can even do it with individual offerings. So therefore, be quiet about it. I actually looked up to see if this wording, heve pikach ushtok, comes up anywhere else, and it doesn't. It only comes up in this Tosefta, although it appears there's a whole list of cases here where you say heve pikach ushtok. You can look in the Tosefta Menachot, the 3rd chapter. Those are one of those things now with Sefaria, you can easily find it. You can just look up Sefaria, Tosefta, chapter 3, and it's all there. So in any case, this is what it says. And what do you see here? Katani miat, it says in any case, and it's true, if there's no choice, you say have a pikach ushtok and you do it anyway. But if you can bring a different one in its place, you should. So obviously, right, since it says omer u'mevi'in acheret tachtea, it sounds like tum'ah dechuyahi b'tzibur. It's only pushed aside, and therefore you should try to find an alternative. If you can't find an alternative, so then we let you bring. That's Rav Sheshet's proof text. So now we're going to have to say, well, what does Rav Nachman do with this source? This source really seems to go against him. So Amar Rav Nachman, Modina hechadiika shirayim la'achila. We're now going to see that Rav Nachman is going to have a few exceptions to his rule. He says, and we actually brought this up in Psachim. Psachim is the one exception to the rule about this. Okay, let me talk about Tumah Utra B'tzibur. I see from a question also, maybe it's not perfectly clear. Tumah Utra B'tzibur can be relevant to lots of different things, whether people are tmeim, whether the object that we're sacrificing is tamei, whether it be the mincha offering or the animal. It could be a whole slew of things. It could be all the kohanim, the majority of kohanim. It could be the majority of people when it comes to the Pesach, because the people have to bring the korban Pesach. So there's a wide range of all the different things that where we could say Tumah Utra B'tzibur. However, there's one big difference between Psachim and everything else. When it comes to korban Pesach, actually, let's start from everything else. When we say Tumah Utra B'tzibur, Dechuyahi B'tzibur, whatever you want to say, that we're allowed to sacrifice objects even though they're impure, if it's a communal offering, or if it's the right? Remember, tzibur we said means two things. Tzibur can mean it's a communal offering, or tzibur can mean the majority of the people are tzmeim, or something like that. Right? That's what we used in Pesach. Anyway, the idea being that when we say Tumah Utra B'tzibur, it allows us to bring the sacrifice, but it doesn't allow us to eat whatever parts of that sacrifice are permitted for eating. Other than one big exception to the rule, which I wouldn't have even mentioned here, except that we learned it very recently, and I want to review, which is the korban Pesach can be eaten if, let's say, the majority of people are tmeim, and we bring the korban Pesach anyway because the majority of people are tmeim, we're allowed to bring it. We are allowed to eat it also. And that's because, if you remember, the whole purpose, or one of the main purposes of the korban Pesach, is to eat the sacrifice. Most sacrifices, it's really about the sacrificial rituals. And yes, there's parts you can eat, but the main thing is to bring the sacrifice. With korban Pesach, it's got the combination where the eating it is either almost as important or just, right? We're not sure exactly if we had to rank it, but it's a very central part. But let's just assume we're talking about all other sacrifices. They don't get eaten if they're done b'tumah. So likewise, this minchata omer, what gets eaten? The minchata omer gets burned. But no, because what do? In all meal offerings, you make a dough. Then, right, this one's made from barley flour. Then you dip your fingers, your three middle fingers, the Kohen dips his three middle fingers in it, scoops up a part. Whatever's left is called the shirayim, depending on which sacrifice. Sometimes the shirayim most cases of the mincha offering, the shirayim get eaten. For example, we saw recently kol minchat kohen kalil tar. Remember, it goes up entirely. So a mincha that a Kohen brings, let's say a voluntary offering, that gets burnt entirely. But this is not one of those. This one gets eaten the remainder. Now, we already said if it's brought b'tumah, you don't eat it unless it's the Korban Pesach. This is not the Korban Pesach. So therefore, Rav Nachman says, listen, the reason why you try to find an alternative is so that the people, since there's shirayim to eat, there's leftovers that people eat, we'd rather have portion that people can eat. So it's true tumah hutra, and it's totally fine. You can bring the mincha omer without it, but since you can't eat the shirayim, better to find an alternative and find one that's pure. So that's why, but not because tumah dechuyai b'tzibur and the tumah is still there, has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with the eating element. So that's his response. Now, as I said, we're going to bring 3 questions against Rav Nachman. The first one from the Tosefta there in Menachot, chapter 3. Meitivei. Hayam akriv minchat parim ve'elim ukvasim. Okay, if you're bringing the mincha that goes along, remember we learned there with every animal, there's a certain amount of flour you use for this meal offering that goes, it's called the, we're going to assume right now they're talking about the minchat nisachim that go with the animals that you bring on the holidays. So if you're bringing the minchat parim elim ukfasim with the bulls, the rams, and the sheep, vinit meit biyado, and the mincha becomes impure. This is just like the previous source. You say, let's go find. You tell the people around, go find a new one, new flour. My love, is this not? Now comes, that's the end of the source. Is this not parim elim ukfasim dechag? Which again, if it's a holiday offering and you say tum'ah hutra b'tzibur, so you should say it's totally fine. You don't need to find an alternative. So Amar Lecha Rav Nachman lo. How's Rav Nachman going to answer the source? He says, no, I'm going to show you that it's not what you thought it was. Parim, for this I charted out on the sheet, what each of these 3 things refer to. They don't refer to the minchat nesachim of the regular sacrifices that we bring, but right, those are the ones, by the way, that we mentioned in our Shmona Esrei of Musaf on all the holidays. We say shlosha esronim lapar u'shnei esronim la'al v'saron lakeves. Right, that's the exact amount of flour you need. Shnei esronim if you're for the bull offering, and shlosha esronim, 3 esronim, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull offering, 3, and then 2 for the ram, 1 for the sheep. That's just, they always tell you, you're bringing all these animal sacrifices, and with that, you have to bring these nesachim. And then it says how much wine and all that. So now, Amar Lecha Rav Nachman lo, you misunderstood. I'm going to explain this braita according to me that it works. I'm going to give you 3 cases where we don't say tumah hutra b'tzibur. Okay, let's see why. In other words, generally tumah hutra b'tzibur. These 3 are exceptions to the rule. Parim, par avodah zarah. If the people make a mistake and they worship avodah zarah accidentally, they have to bring a par to atone for this. Now, even though, so he's going to say the parim in that line is referring to that particular par. Now, it is a tzibur offering, it's a communal offering, but why is it different than all the rest? And we don't say in that case, tumah hutra, we'd say only dechuya. It's pushed aside, but it's still there and better to find an alternative. Since it doesn't have an exact time that you have to bring it, it's not like a holiday offering that has to be brought on that day, but this has a time frame, no time frame associated with it. In that case, he's going to say when there's a time frame associated with it. When there's no time frame, you can bring in another date, then we allow it. Next, Elim be'elo shel Aharon. We're talking about the ayil that Aharon brings for himself. If you remember, right? It says at the beginning of next week's parsha, "Bezok yavo Aharon al kodesh, parben bakar lechatat va'ayil leolah." So this is his own ayil. In which case, right, it's no longer tzibur, it's a yachid. There it does have a set time. It has to be done on Yom Kippur, but since it's his own offering, therefore he should find an alternative because it's not a communal offering. Kvasim, what's the keves? Bekeves habayim omer diika shirayim la'achila. Oh, the keves. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, this was important. The nisachim that go with the sacrifices are all burnt entirely. They don't get eaten. That's why we couldn't use the excuse we used with the previous one. But if you say they're not the minchat nisachim that go with the sacrifices, but they're maybe the mincha is specifically, the keves is referring to the korban omer. Korban omer was brought with a keves, a sheep, and had this mincha offering that went with it. And again, we don't want to bring the mincha that goes with the keves on the Omer if we can find an alternative because of the shirayim, because of the remainders that get eaten. By the way, another reason I want to point out that they explain why they thought originally this was the Minchat Nisachim, and then why Nisachim, if it was referring to the holiday, the animals, why didn't they talk about the animal itself? Why are they talking about the flour of the Mincha offering? Why not the animal itself? They said there's a big difference because the Nisachim, this is a law we're going to learn much later, but I figured I'd already tell you now because we're learning about it. The holiday offerings obviously have to be brought on that particular day. But once you bring the sacrifice, the nisachim that go along with it could actually better to bring them that day, but you can actually bring them, I believe it's up to 10 days. You have a wide range of time in which you can bring it. So since that's the case, we basically brought the Tosefta brought this as an example because there was more time to go looking for an alternative. Whereas when it's that day and you're sitting right at the spot, maybe you don't necessarily have to look for an alternative. Okay, so that was the second question against Rav Nachman. The first question against Rav Nachman, and we answered it because we said it's not talking about the nisachim. Each one has a different reason why, even if you say tum'ah utra b'tzibur, it's entirely permitted. In these cases, not. Okay, I'll just review. Either it doesn't have a set time and therefore it doesn't apply, or it's an individual offering, or it has parts that get eaten, and therefore we prefer you find an option where you then be able to eat the remainder. Second source against him, Meitive. Dam shenitma uzrako, v'shogeg hortza b'mezid lo hortza. If you have blood that became impure, also you're not supposed to sprinkle it on the altar, but if you did anyway, if you did it unwittingly, you didn't realize maybe the blood was impure, or you didn't know that you couldn't sprinkle impure blood on the altar, hortza, your sacrifice is accepted. B'mezid lo hortza. But if it was done alternatively, then it doesn't work. Now, what does this mean, hortza lo hortza? So before we go on and I explain what the contradiction is, let me just explain to you what this is. This is called the tzitz. It's one of the bigdei kuna. Now remember, the Kohen Gadol has 8 vestments that he wears. One of them is called the tzitz. It says, it's hard to see from the picture exactly because of the glare, but it says Kodesh LaHashem. Okay, Kodesh and the Lamed are in small letters, and then the Yud Ke Vav Ke is in big letters, and it's a gold breastplate that goes on the head of the, not a breastplate, sorry, a gold, like a forehead ornament. It goes around his forehead. Okay, it's like a crown type thing. This is called the tzitz, a tiara. Thank you. Call it a tiara. This is it was a head plate that the Kohen Gadol wore, and it was used to atone for sins that happened. Now, how and why this works is a whole question. I'm not going to get into the details of that because we don't really understand that. But there's this concept that, and we're going to talk, I want to specifically be very careful of my words. I want to say that when the Kohen Gadol is wearing it, but it's not necessarily true. We're going to have a look at later today, whether it works even if he's not wearing it, that the tzitz has the capability to atone for sins of impurity in the temple. Okay, we're going to learn this all later today. So therefore, if a sacrifice is brought with impurity, it's going to atone. So now, here it says, b'mezid lo hortza. It doesn't atone for mezid, and Rashi says there, b'mezid lo hortza, af al pi shetzitz meratzeh, even though the tzitz is there, and the tzitz, this head plate, does basically atone for it. Why is it a problem? They say, kansuhu Rabbanan shelo yehe basar ne'echal, aval ba'alim miyu nitkapu. When it says b'mezid lo hortza, it really means it actually was effective, your sacrifice, but you can't eat the meat. Okay, we don't allow you to eat the meat because the blood had become impure, and therefore we don't want to, it's kind of like before, we don't want to allow all sorts of things because then people might do other things. But the idea here being is that if you did it, b'mezid lo hortza, but b'shogeg hortza, it seems to imply that what? That the tzitz, right? That it's not mutal. If tumah hutra, then even b'mezid, it would have been hortza, right? Because we said tumah hutra b'tzibur. This is a weird source because the answer is going to be obvious, which is the Gemara is going to answer, where did you see the word tzibur here? It never said tzibur. So kitanya hahidi yachid. This was an individual offering. In the individual offering, the basic concept here is if you need the tzitz to be meratzeh, and we're going to see this all throughout, then it must be it's not hutra. If it was hutra, you don't need anything to atone for it. It's just entirely as if there's no tumah. But once you say this is talking about an individual offering, well, then it has nothing to do with tumah hutra tzibur because it's not tzibur, and then we have no question. So that's how they resolve it. third source. Tashma. Alma hatzitz meratzeh. What does this tzitz atone for? Al adam, whether it's blood, which we just saw a minute ago, ala basal, on meat, ala chelev, on the fats, shenitma, that become impure. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezi, bein ba'onis, bein b'ratzon, bein b'yachi, bein b'tzibur. Whether it's shogeg, whether it's unwitting or intentional, whether it was someone forced it on you or it happened b'ratzon, you willingly did it, caused it to be impure, or you brought it knowing it was impure and you anyway sacrificed it. Bein b'yachi, bein b'tzibur, whether it's individual or whether it's communal. Now, what do you see here? The tzitz, this is what I said before. If the tzitz atones, that means that there's a problem. Now here it says the tzitz atones for individual and communal offerings. So then it sounds like if you think it's entirely permitted, you wouldn't need the tzitz to come and atone. So Amar Lecha Rav Nachman, what can Rav Nachman answer to this? Ki katane hatzitz meratzeh ad yachid. When it says the tzitz is meratzeh, it's referring only to the individual and not to the communal. B'yibait ema, which is a bit of a difficult answer because it said bein b'yachi bein b'tzibur. So here there's an alternative. Afilu tema b'tzibur b'hanach delo kviya luhuzman. Again, what did we say? When it doesn't have a set time, it could be communal, like the par avodah zarah, which is a communal offering, but it doesn't have to be brought at a set time. And we said even Rav Nachman agrees that the tzitz does not atone in that case. I'm sorry, that tumah is not huitcha b'tzibur, and therefore you need the tzitz to atone because it's not entirely permitted. So that's how we resolve the next source. Meitive. Now we're going to bring the source. That's going to be a question on Rav Sheshet, at least according to the version that we have in front of us. Okay, we're reading this pasuk. In fact, I'll read the whole pasuk now. I brought it on your sheet. It's Shmot Kafchet Lamed Chet. It's talking about the tzitz. It should be on Aharon's forehead. That's where it sounds like it has to be on his forehead to work. He will bear the iniquity, the sins of the sacrifices. Okay, that the Jews will sanctify, meaning they made sacrifices, and there was a problem. He will atone for it, that the tzitz. And it should be on his forehead forever, always, be a better word. Okay, liratzon, to appease them before God. So now we're just going to look at the words. The end of today's half, we're going to darshan that whole pasuk. Now it doesn't say there, notice it's brought for tumah purposes, for impurity. So how do we know it's talking about impurity, which we already assumed, but we don't know that right now. So what type of avonot are there in the temple? And there's always these famous three that go together: pigul, notar, and tameh, because they're the three ways that sacrifices become disqualified. Pigul, if you remember, is when a Kohen has an intent to, let's say, for example, while he's doing one of the major avodot, like for example, while he's slaughtering, he thinks that he's going to sprinkle the blood or burn the parts on the altar at the wrong time or in the wrong place, right? Meaning tomorrow, let's say, which you're not allowed to, or outside the temple or something like that. That's pigul. And notar is when you leave the meat over beyond its designated time. Different sacrifices have different amount of times in which you're supposed to eat the meat. In the cases where you're supposed to eat the meat, if you leave over the meat beyond the given time, it's notar. Both of these, if you eat the meat, depending on the situation, but they often have karet associated with it. So now they're going to say, Eza avon hu noseh. So which sin is this dealing with? Im avon pigul harei kvar ne'emar lo yiratzeh. It says there is no ritzoi. Ritzoi means God is appeased and you can bring it. No, pigul, sacrifice, entirely disqualified. You can't bring it. You can't eat it. If you eat it, you get karet. That's very serious. The tzitz clearly does not atone for that. Im avon notar harei kvar ne'emar lo yechashev. By the way, these words come up. The lo yechashev appears in the same pasuk about pigul. There's a whole dealing. It's in Vayikra Zayin Yuvchet, and it sounds like it's talking about pigul, but also sort of sounds like it's talking about notar. And the commentaries, the Gemara explains in other places. I assume in Zvachim, I seem to remember, but assume it's in Zvachim. They darshan that pasuk to say it's talking about pigul and notar, and therefore that that one's talking about notar. The different pasuk was talking about pigul, even though it uses the word pigul in that pasuk. I'm not going to get into all those details. But the main thing is both of them say, lo yiratzeh, can't be appeased, lo yichashev, it doesn't count, meaning that seats can't atone for these sins. So therefore, what's left of those three? The only one that's left is tuma. And not only by process of elimination, but also what's unique about tuma that's different than pigul and notav? What does that mean? That tuma has something that is lenient about it that isn't true for notar and pigul. And what is that? Oh, in a communal offering, it's hutra b'tzibur, right? It's entirely permitted. Since that's the case, when it happens in an individual, the seats, right, where it's not hutra, but since the concept, there's a place where tuma could be entirely permitted, therefore, in other cases, when tuma happens where it's not entirely permitted, the seats will come and will atone for it. So what do you see here? Kasha l'Rav Sheshet, because it says tum'ah hutra b'tzibur. It doesn't say tum'ah dechuyahi b'tzibur. It's pushed aside. It says it's entirely permitted. So this is a difficulty for Rav Sheshet. To which the Gemara answers, I already told you this. Tanahi, it's actually a debate among Tanaim. Tanya, as it says in the following Braita. Now we're going to show a Braita. It's going to take a little while to get there, but it's going to talk about the tzitz. And we're going to see that the debate between them seems to be on the basis or having to do with, connected with a debate about whether Tuma is hutra b'tzibur or dechuyayi b'tzibur. Ditan, tzitz. Ben sheyesh no mitzcho, ben she'eno mitzcho. I told you I was very careful about my wording before. I said it has to be on his fire, but then I said, well, maybe not necessarily. So according to Rabbi Shimon, we're going to see tzitz. Ben sheyesh no mitzcho, ben she'eno mitzcho meratzeh. He doesn't have to be wearing it on his forehead for it to work. If the tzitz is sitting on the counter in the temple, it works also. Okay, even though the pshat of that verse sounded like has to be on his forehead, right? It said v'haya al metzach aharon. It was on his forehead, and then it even says it has to be there always. So we're going to have to explain that. But right now we're just going to see the different approaches. Then we're going to explain them. So he says it doesn't have to be on his forehead for it to work. Rabbi Yehuda omer odeu al mitzcho meratzeh. When it's on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, then it works. When it's not on the forehead, it doesn't work. It sounds a little bit like when Moshe's hands were held up in the battle of Amalek, right? And if he put his hands down, then they would lose. It's this idea somehow that there's a, right? Because you have to think about how exactly this works, and it's hard to understand, as I said, how the tzitz works. Somehow when he's wearing it, so then it has this effect. But when he's not wearing it, and it's just sitting on the side, it doesn't work, okay? Just doesn't work that way. Again, it's hard to understand exactly how this seats works in general, but we'll leave that. So now, Amarlo Rabbi Shimon, here comes the debate between them, a discussion. Rabbi Shimon says to him, Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. If you remember the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, and we're going to see this coming up, okay, next week in Shul, we're going to read Parshat Acharei Mot, where we read the entire avoda of the Kohen Gadol. So pay close attention when you get to the words. If you're in Mincha this week, you already started to get a sneak preview about what the work of the Kohen Gadol is on that day. And we're going to see that he wears the clothes of a regular Kohen Hadiot. So now, if that's the case, he doesn't have the tzitz on his head. So now, he says like this, Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim will prove it. She'eno deo al mitzcho, it's not on his forehead on that day. Umiratzeh. And clearly there's ritzoy on that day. If something were to happen, it was done b'tumah, it would work. So Amarlo Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? Hanach, that's a bad proof. Hanach lekohen gadol b'Yom Kippurim shetumah hutra lo b'tzibur. You don't need the tzitz to atone on Yom Kippurim because everything the Kohen Gadol does is communal, although we did talk about the ayel that was individual, but let's put that aside right now. The major work on Yom Kippurim is all communal offerings. If it's communal offerings, well, you don't need the tzitz. So you can't prove to me that everything works, even if it's done b'tumah, because of the tzitz on that day, even though it's sitting on the counter, or sitting somewhere. We don't know where they left it, but it was sitting somewhere. But it's because tumah utra b'tzibur. Now, why didn't Rabbi Shimon say that? It must be. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon didn't think that and thought that you needed the tzitz to atone in Yom Kippurim because he must hold the tumah dechuya. So we show here that Rabbi Shimon holds tumah is dechuya. It's pushed aside, but it's still there, and that's why you need the tzitz to atone. And that's why he proves that tzitz doesn't necessarily have to be on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol because it clearly works on Yom Kippur, even though he's not wearing it. And Rabbi Yehuda says no, you don't even need the tzitz on Yom Kippur because Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. There's something interesting here, which is the halacha lamaaseh. We paskin, the Rambam specifically paskins, like and in general they paskin like Rav Sheshet, that Tumah is only dechuya, which makes sense that they say that, right? It's almost the safer approach to say it's not totally overridden. We should still try to avoid impurity, right? If we say it's hutra, you might end up with this leniency. People will be more lax about Tumah in the temple. So we hold Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. However, in this machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about the tzitz, he paskins like Rabbi Yehuda that it has to be on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol to work. So even though Rabbi Yehuda is on the basis of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, and the Rambam doesn't hold Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, he seems to disconnect these two issues, okay, and not see that they're so clearly connected, and you could still hold Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur and yet hold like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to the Kohen Gadol. You could say also both are more stringent positions, right? To say that tzitz has to be on the head, and to say that Tumah is only Dechuya, it's only pushed off. So now Amar Abaye. Abaye says, I want to point out something about this machloket between them though. B'nishbal hatzitz, this machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and we've also be between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet. B'nishbal hatzitz t'kolei lo pligi d'lo meratzeh. If the tzitz is broken, let's say it breaks into two, breaks in half. And when we say it has to be on the head of the Kohen Gadol, or it doesn't have to be on the Kohen of it doesn't have to be on the head of the Kohen Gadol, on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol. If we say that, that's only if it's sitting on a counter and not broken. But everyone agrees to lo meratzeh if it's broken. It has to be intact. Ki pligi detali b'sikta. The question is, right, I keep saying on the counter, they're saying if it's hanging on a peg. Okay, if it's hanging on a peg, will it work or not? So then Rabbi Yehuda Savar, and now we're going to learn it where they get it from, the verse. Rabbi Yehuda holds, al hametzach v'nasa. So it says, V'haya al metzach Aharon, v'nasa tavon HaKodashim. So he connects the two. When it's on the forehead of Aharon, then it will atone. That's a very simple reading of the verse. The Rabbi Shimon Savar, tamid l'ratzon l'fnei Hashem. It says it's always going to provide atonement. So now the Gemara says, right, they're going to explain how he gets it from those words. My tamid, what does it mean tamid? If you want to say it's always on his forehead, well, that's not possible. Why? Could that possibly be? Here's a great line. Does he not have to go to the bathroom, the Kohen Gadol, right? Is he beyond normal needs of a person? Of course he goes to the bathroom. When he goes to the bathroom, he's not going to walk in with this head plate that says on it the Shema Meforash of Hashem, right? The Yud Kei Vav Kei. So, or Milo Ba'imeinam, or does he never go to sleep? Of course, it's not always on his forehead. So what does it mean always, right? We see this word always, like the lechem apanim is always on the table, and the ner tamid, and right, there's things that are always. So what does always mean? There it means they're always there, but here it's on somebody's body. If it's on somebody's body, it can't be on his body always. Ela tamid meratzehu. He says the word tamid must be coming to tell you it's always atoning, whether he's wearing it or whether he's not wearing it. Ula Rabbi Yehuda. So now what's he going to do with the word tamid? Hanami ktiv tamid. So what does he learn with tamid? Ha'i tamid shelo yasiach da'ato mimenu. Tamid means you always have to be thinking about it. When it's on you, you can't forget that you're wearing this, right? We sometimes forget what we're wearing, right? Sometimes I'll give you a great example. You walk around with sunglasses on top of your head, and then you're looking all around your house for your sunglasses because you don't realize they're on your head because you forgot that you put them there. Kohen Gadol can't do that. He doesn't have the luxury to forget about what's on his head. He has to be always thinking. He's bearing the name of God on his forehead. You can't just ignore that. And now we're going to bring practical relevance from this to our lives. What is that? As Rabbi Baruch Huna says, when you're wearing your tefillin, you have to always be touching them and remembering that they're there. And they learn it from the tzitz. It only has one name of God in it, and yet Amra Torah al mitzchot tamid. And the Torah said has to be on your metzach tamid, which they explain, and this is proving how Rabbi Yehuda would explain it, as we explained, shelo yasiach da'ato mimenu, that you won't forget that it's there. So tefillin sheyesh b'hem azkarot harbeh, the tefillin have more mentions than just one name of God in them, because right there are all these psukim that God's name appears many times. Al acha kama v'kama, all the more so. Do you have to pay attention that you're wearing the tefillin? You can't forget about the fact that you're wearing tefillin, which is probably one of the reasons why they used to wear tefillin all day and they no longer do that, because it's hard for people to be always in the mindset of thinking about that you're wearing them. So from there, we took this concept of the tzitz, which is so foreign to us, both how it works and we're certainly not in temple times anymore. And they brought it back to our lives about having to do with tefillin. And even though many of us women don't wear tefillin, but still has to do with something that's practical today, which is this idea that if you're wearing God's name on you, you have to be thinking about it at all times, and you can't leave it aside and forget about it. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. So just to review our structure, we brought a proof for Rav Sheshet, the Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. We explained how Rav Nachman reads that. Then we brought 3 questions of Rav Nachman, explained them, 1 question on Rav Sheshet. And since we couldn't explain it, we basically said it must be a machloket Tanaim. And with that machloket Tanaim, we finished our sugya, delving a little bit more in depth into the machloket between them about whether the Kohen Gadol needs to wear the tzitz or doesn't, and showed how it connects to this machloket of Tumah Dechuya or Tumah Hutra. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone, and a great day.